And the New York Times says Ukraine has opened effectively a second front at sea,
Yes.
just far away from the front line. And now we are
Yes.
not just talking about the deep strikes inside Russia, but,
Yes.
you know, in a different directions, thousands kilometers away from Ukraine and from Russia. Do you agree this is no longer just a symbolic, but, you know, a new phase of the war?
Well, yes. In a way, there's been many new phases. The drone campaign
Yes.
has been very audacious against the oil sector. I mean, there's drone campaign against many things, but against the oil sector, the Russian oil sector, it's been very audacious and very creative and very successful. And I want to point out, just for political reasons, it's clear that this is coordinated with the Americans and American intelligence. Your intelligence chief just this Friday, I think it was, had an interview with the press talking about how much assistance your country gets in intelligence and satellite reconnaissance from the Americans, much of which actually comes from commercial satellite companies. So my point being, this drone campaign is not something the Americans do not approve of. They clearly approve of it. Okay, that's different than what happened earlier in the later Biden administration. This is a big change. There's no complaint when when Ukrainian drones and missiles repeatedly hit Novorossiya and now hit the ships in the Black Sea and now hit ships, I think what you're referring to, in the Eastern Mediterranean. Now, what I find just very interesting about this, if you want to shut down the Russian oil export system, which I believe is possible, what you have to do is, on the one hand, you have to hit the ports and the refineries. When you hit the refineries, they have to export more oil because they can't refine it. And that's been happening. Now, there's a glut in the market also. So for at least 2 or 3 months, all of Russia's export terminals, the main ones that face west, Novorossiya in the Black Sea, Primorsk, and Ust-Lunga in the Baltic, those are the big ones, the important ones. They've been running at 100% capacity. They essentially can't export any more oil. And when the sanctions were put on by the Americans, they had nowhere to send. They wanted to get rid of the oil. They needed to move it out. They have to, and there's not enough customers because of the sanctions, but also because there's a glut of oil in the market. So Russia has been loading oil onto ships that a lot of them have nowhere to go, and the amount of Russian oil that's floating on the water is 40% higher now than it was in August. Worldwide, there's like 1 billion barrels, including the Russian, floating there. So Russia has this problem. It can't get the oil. It's starting to get to the point where it can't get the oil out. Okay, so hitting Novorossiya and the ships going to was important, but the Ukrainians had to do something about Primorsk and Ust-Lunga, and that's pretty far away. They can hit those ports, but I thought this was brilliant. I hadn't thought of this. The ships, a lot of them, have to go through around Europe, through the Mediterranean, and then the Suez Canal, so they can hit them in Eastern Mediterranean. This was a ship, I believe, that was going on its way to Ust-Lunga, and it got hit. So this is very positive, and what I think will happen, another tranche in sanctions, another upping of this air campaign against the ports and refineries, pretty soon Russia can't export the oil. And what do they have to do? It's going to be the middle of winter, very cold. West Siberia is where the overwhelming majority of Russian oil comes from, and Siberia is cold, very cold. Those are very old fields, 50, 60, 70 years old, very delicate fields. If you have to shut them rapidly in the wintertime without very carefully flushing fluids through that dilute the oil and flushing oil out of the pipes, even then it's difficult to get them going again. But if they have to shut a number of these fields rapidly in the winter, they will probably be permanently damaged. It will really undermine the future ability of Russia to be a petrostate. And I
Yeah.
think this is where this campaign is going, if Trump chooses to go to the next stage.
Right. Dr. O'Donnell, but by striking so far beyond the Black Sea, What message
Yeah.
is Ukraine sending, not only to Russia, because to Russia we understood, but to energy markets in general?
Well, this is quite interesting. First of all, it's interesting. Nobody in Europe, none of the allies, the Americans, the Europeans, or for that matter, the OPEC states, the Gulf states, who are very central to this, nobody has said they don't have a right to strike these. Some are upset, okay, but they don't say don't. It's a war, and in a war, you can hit the ships of the other country. Doesn't wherever you want, you can hit them. So there's no problem there as far as what this says. Now, what this says to markets. Normally, the case in the market would be that if somebody starts hitting Russian ships that carry oil, Russia was a very high percentage, maybe close to 10% of the world's oil was being produced in Russia. And the West would always try to, this was the idea of the price caps. They would say, oh my God, we can't take Russian oil off the market. The price would spike everywhere. All the governments in the West would have problems. It would only be a direct war, maybe with the United States and Russia, where such a thing would be done. That was the mentality. That was the mentality left over from the Cold War. But right now, we have a special time in the international oil system. There's a glut of oil. There's much more oil being produced and able to be produced and on the market than is needed. China every month is buying about 1 million barrels of oil and just putting it in storage, or the glut would be even worse. So the price is coming down. Everybody thought $60 a barrel would be the bottom, right? Now they're talking about the price going into the 50s. This is stunning. I mean, they're taking Russian oil off the market. They're also taking Venezuelan oil off the market. They're taking Iranian oil off the market. And as the sanctions hit Russia, after a little shock of a day or two, the price goes down. It's not what anybody would expect. So there's very good objective conditions to really hit Russia hard and to think about taking it off the market. OPEC has on paper about 6 million barrels that they could still put on the market. So even if they have 4 or 5, I mean, Russia's exporting something like 3.4 now by sea. Even if it took that all offline, it can be replaced. So this is a very good objective conditions in the market for doing this to Russia finally. It should be taken advantage of.
Dr. O'Donnell, and Bloomberg also reports that Russia's oil export revenues have fallen to their lowest level since early 2023, but I've heard somewhere even since 2022. So is this just temporary turbulence, or
No,
it's the beginning of something deeper and huge problems?
that's what I'm saying. Russia is its oil sector is the West, Ukraine and its allies are going after the Russian oil sector now in a much more rational way, a much more effective way than they ever did with the oil price cap. It's both very effective sanctions and military attacks on their infrastructure. And yes, it's being very effective. The amount of oil that they're able to sell is going down, and the price they have to offer. If you're in India, if you're in China, those two countries are having 85% of the imports of Russian oil just before these latest sanctions were put on. If you're in one of those countries and want to buy Russian oil, you're taking a big risk. And so they're demanding big, what should I say, big cuts in the price, reductions in the price. Latest thing I saw is maybe West Ural's oil was going for something, it's hard to say really because it's very hidden, something like $35 a barrel. Now it always sells for a little bit less than the world price, but that's considerably
That's,
below the
yeah,
world price.
absolutely.
Okay. Now here's
Unbelievable.
the thing, and I'll just say in 2020, in March 2020, a very ill-advised oil war was started by Russia, by Sechin. Putin agreed to Sechin's plan to attack American shale. He thought he could dump Russian oil on the market just when Corona was starting, drive the price down, put American shale out of business, and undermine the ability of Americans to sanction the Russians. It was a very badly made plan. The Saudis crushed them in a couple days, and they had to surrender and stop. But at that time, what they said when they made their plan, they said they could stand about $25 a barrel as long as they had at that time $600 billion, I think it was, in their reserves. Their reserves are down quite a bit, and at 35 is getting close to 25. Okay, so, and they're waging a war. They weren't waging a war there. So they're starting to get very close to the level where they're not really going to be making much of any profit, or not. It's not a matter of making a profit on the field, not making the levels they need to feed the state to continue. So it's getting very close to there. That's why I think the Americans should go to the next stage with these sanctions, the Senate sanctions, and also assist the Ukrainians in going to the next stage in hitting the oil from these various ports.